Hello, everybody, and welcome to What the F is Feminist Housing Plan. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're so excited to have author and professor Leslie Kern here with us to talk about feminist cities, feminist public policy, and how we might turn those concepts into a feminist housing plan here in New York City. I know we have some true believers here in the Zoom room today who have been excited about this project from the beginning. I hope that we also have some skeptics here who are staring at your screen thinking, indeed, what the F is this all about? Thank you especially for being here. Please feel free to ask us any questions you may have in the chat or in the Q&A, and we hope we have a robust discussion today and maybe even some converts by the end of the session. Today is a book event. Leslie's book, Feminist City, came out earlier this year. And if we were all together, there would be a copy of a book waiting for you in a CHPC tote bag or a stack at the back of the room to be signed by the author. We hope to recreate that a bit today. So if you are, and we're still into physical books here at CHPC. So if you would like a copy of Leslie's book, please email us your mailing address at newlens@chpc.org and we will send you a copy. It's really, really wonderful. I've read it cover to cover. I want to start by thanking our sponsors today. We have amazing sponsors. Normally this April, we would be doing a massive event at Times Square. There will be 1,000 of us all in a room together talking about CHPC's projects and honoring some of the people who've done great work in housing and urban planning this year. That's not possible, obviously. And so we're going to do a series of web events this year and hopefully in the spring of 2022. I look forward to serving you all chicken in the Marriott Ballroom as soon as it's safe to do so. So thank you so much to our sponsors who are hanging in there with us, even though it's a virtual event this year. Really, really appreciate it. I want to talk a little bit about our prior projects that we're also working on. Public Housing Revolution is investigating a question of what would happen if instead of the housing authority or a city agency or city hall or a developer was the client for a public housing regeneration, what happens if we treated the tenants as if they were clients? Ask them what they wanted, what their needs were, and really turned the current system upside down on its head to focus on the tenants and elevate resident decision-making in that process. So we have a report out on that subject, and we hope to be able to test that out here in New York City from some of the lessons that we've learned from London and the UK earlier before the pandemic began. Feminist Housing Plan is under our umbrella project, New Lens for New York City's Housing Plan. As many of you know, I spent most of my career working in city government at the housing department, really churning away at the units factory that has become so popular and so robust and so effective, frankly, in city government. And I'm very, very proud of that work. And it's amazing as a management tool. It's not, however, housing policy, and there's a lot of issues that are left unaddressed by focusing on units as the sole metric. So what New Lens for New York City's housing plan hopes to do is to really ask the question, why, for who, what are we trying to achieve in terms of our housing policy, and working backwards towards choosing our policies and our metrics from there, as opposed to starting with a unit goal and then backing into our policies afterwards. So we've published our housing plan for a city of immigrants. We have a forthcoming feminist housing plan, RX for housing, housing is healthcare, and a variety of other topics that we'll be rolling out throughout the year in the hopes that the next mayor's housing plan really starts with goals and values and then follows with the policies that would address those needs. Also recently, last week, came out with an op-ed in the Daily News called Brutal Bureaucracy. The idea had been kicking around in my brain for a long time, and then finally the right words came to me to describe it through a confluence of events. One was I was getting ready, as many of us are, to start doing our taxes, and it occurred to me how seamless the mortgage interest deduction that I'm able to take is incorporated into the tax process that I already have to do each year as compared to some of the other housing subsidies. Ford Foundation came out with a housing playbook for the new Biden administration. And one of the key sentences and phrases in that playbook is all housing is subsidized. And that in the US is really true. So how do we subsidize various forms of housing and how easy do we make it? After many, many years of shouting from the rooftops at city government that it was not necessary, for example, to do a in-person briefing and to drag all your family members to 100 Gold Street to do a Section 8 briefing, when you get a Section 8 voucher, suddenly when the pandemic hit, that was suddenly possible. After for years and years of being told that was impossible, illegal, impractical, all of a sudden that was possible. So I just want us to take this moment where all of a sudden we're rethinking so much of how we live our lives and so much of how we run government and what we need from our government in a way that really addresses the needs of the people we're trying to serve, as opposed to the bureaucracies that are administering the work. So what the F is a feminist housing plan? I'm going to kick it off with some thoughts on CHPC side and then send it over to Leslie to talk about her incredible Feminist City book. So some of the assumptions in public policy are that all households are from nuclear families. We assume a lot about households that don't apply to most Americans. We assume that households are all nuclear families, that men are the sole or primary breadwinners. So our economic and social safety net are built on the assumption that households are a married couple with their children and that men are the primary breadwinners for the family. Though in reality, the vast majority of American mothers today contribute a significant portion of household earnings, and children are far more likely to be raised by two working parents or a single parent than by one parent who works and one who stays home. Yet, policy has not prioritized the needs of working women, putting them at a disadvantage when it comes to supporting their families. So at a time when women were actively discouraged from working, New Deal policies laid the foundation for a social safety net that was attached to labor market participation. So most women could only access the newly established public benefits as their husband's dependents. Meanwhile, there were few public resources created to meet society's care needs, which were regarded as a matter of the private home rather than of a public concern. Economic and social policies in the US have followed similar trends since the New Deal, especially in comparison to other developed nations, where today the US is the only developed country that lacks a national paid family leave policy. So again, while we assume that men go to work and women stay home, that the experiences and needs of men are the default, which makes cities and transit designed for male commutes and under prioritizes the needs of women in housing design. So a couple of issues rose to the top when we talk about housing and homelessness as a feminist issue. 89% of families with children in DHS shelters are female-headed. Domestic violence is the #1 cause of family homelessness in New York City, and 30% of transgender individuals experience homelessness at some point in their life. NYCHA, similarly, 3 out of 4 families in NYCHA are headed by women, 40% of households living in NYCHA are headed by seniors, and a full 83% of households with Section 8 vouchers in the US are female-headed. So fixing NYCHA must be a top housing policy priority. So here we have several of the typical low-wage jobs here in New York City and across the country. So because women earn lower wages and have lower incomes than men, they are inherently able to afford fewer options for safe and affordable housing. Women comprise 60% of the nation's lowest paid workers. Occupational devaluation is a major contributor to this disparity. So you may be looking at this chart and saying, well, these are different jobs, though they're different types of jobs, they have different risks, so of course they're paid differently. That's not a gender issue, that's just the type of job that it is. Well, turns out that men earn more than women even when they have the same jobs, the same skills and level of education. And as a result, occupations held by more men than women are better paid, even while those held by more women are paid less. And the scariest part, research shows that if there's a female-dominated field and as more men start entering that workforce, the wages in those fields have increased accordingly. So men actually bring the higher wages up with them. So it has nothing to do with the type of job that you have. It does seem to be driven by the gender of the people who have the job. So this creates a real affordability gap that is gendered. 3 out of 5 New York City households who make less than 30% of AMI are headed by women. And 44% of New York City's female-headed households with children earn less than 50% of AMI. So building more deeply affordable housing will be a feminist solution. Public transit too. About 6 out of 10 female workers versus 5 out of 10 male commute to work versus public transit. And male households are more than 30% more likely than female-headed households to own a vehicle in New York City. So creating neighborhoods that are centered around public transit, that have easy access to amenities that you don't need a car to access, would also be a feminist forward issue. So again, while the concept of a feminist housing plan sounds scary to people, I've definitely gotten some responses asking about how difficult affordable housing already is, and do we really need to kind of complicate that process more with a gender equity lens? Well, the solutions, though, are not radical at all. So if you address homelessness, if you make NYCHA top priority, if you focused on the deepest affordability and ensure that your affordable housing has good access to public transit, these would all be feminist ways of addressing a public housing policy. So we are not done with our feminist housing plan. We are still seeking your ideas. So please drop in the chat other places where you think that gender neutral or supposedly gender neutral policies are affecting us in the work that we do day to day as housers. Please let us know. We're still working towards what our feminist housing plan should look like collaboratively with the rest of the industry. And now I want to pass it over to Leslie Kern, the professor at Mount Allison University in New Brunswick in Canada, and the author of Feminist City, Claiming Space in a Man-Made World. Thank you so much for joining us, Leslie.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm just thrilled to be invited to contribute some small piece to what seems like a really amazing piece of work, the entire New Lens for Housing project and all of the key areas that CHPC has identified as central for interventions. For me, I wrote Feminist City in part to help us denaturalize the spaces that we take for granted, and to help people look beyond bricks and mortar to really start to understand the ideas, norms, values, and even biases that get built right into our streets, our workplaces, our homes, our transit systems, and more. So the idea that the city is a man-made space is not necessarily one that is apparent or intuitive to everybody, although I would argue that for many women, we know this on a gut level, even if we haven't expressed it in those words exactly. And some of the slides and topics that I'm going to touch on today will, I think, illuminate that for us. So what do I mean when I say the man-made city? Well, on a sort of very basic level, it's long been a fact that the professions of planning, urban design, architecture, and urban policymaking are quite male-dominated. So what does this mean? Well, simply, it's hard to design, plan, and build for experiences that you haven't had, that you're not aware of, or that aren't pressing in your everyday life. So the issue of representation in those fields is part of the picture here. And as a result of that, women's needs and experiences have often been positioned as afterthoughts in the city. So something that we'll deal with later, once we have our basic plans, our roadways, our buildings, our houses, so on, then we'll deal with whatever complaints or issues or problems that women might seem to have with the way things have been set up. Historically as well, women themselves have been kind of seen as problems for the city, not just as afterthoughts, but they're the way that they live, their concerns have been seen as things that we need to address. And this goes back, kind of hundreds of years, where women just being out in public was seen as an affront to decency and normal ways of doing things. And this sort of long-standing legacy of the divide between public and private space, and the association of women with private space, men with public space, is still part of the texture of our cities today. Again, on a very basic level, the male body is still taken as the universal standard in design. There's a brilliant book by Carolyn Criado Perez called Invisible Women that is all about this gender data gap, and she talks about it in the context of cities as well, where the everything from how high the kind of grab bar on the subway is when you're trying to, balance, to the height of seating and of countertops and so on is designed around a kind of a standard or an average male body, although that male body tends to be, a white North American or European adult male body. So it's also not universal. And I uncovered this interesting little tidbit in Toronto that found that when planners are calculating the wind tunnel effects of potential new buildings, that the standard body for those effects that they use in their calculations is a male body, right? So the male body as a standard is, we can see in all sorts of things. I'm sure many women have experienced the unpleasant temperature of most office buildings and public spaces. Indoor public spaces, and that's also partly a result of who the comfort of these spaces have been designed for. Jessica mentioned this a little bit as well, the way in which city kind of transportation networks are set up to prioritize what was historically a typical male pattern of work and home life that involved linear journeys from the home on the kind of outskirts or outer edges of the city into the center city or into an industrial area for work in a kind of linear manner that occurred at predictable times of day, whether 9 to 5 or some other kind of shift work. And decades of research have shown that women's journeys through the city don't look like this. They involve more stops. They involve a mix of caregiving roles, household consumption roles like picking up food for dinner or diapers, and getting to their paid work as well. So transit systems that function in this linear model end up for women being systems that are actually quite cumbersome, where we might have to pay multiple times to take multiple trips, or you have to travel all the way into the city center and then out to go to another neighborhood. I won't even go too much into this, but public transit systems are often also places where all over the world women report incredible levels of violence and harassment as well. So underlying all of this, again, as Jessica mentioned, there's gendered assumptions about home, right? Who is in the home? What work is being done in the home? What counts as work in the public sphere? The division of public and private spaces, and more, structure all sorts of urban planning and decision-making. This has been, I think, has become more visible to many of us during the pandemic, when so many undeniably gendered effects of both the pandemic itself and of the kind of public health and public policy decisions and economic decisions that have been made around how to deal with the pandemic have reproduced gendered inequalities. So I won't go into detail on these, but these are the kind of headlines that we might see from really many countries around the world about the gender divide in household labor, about women's having to, prioritize staying home with sick children or just waiting for testing while not being able to go to their work. And of course, women being forced from the workplace in record numbers. And the pandemic seems like the cause of these things, but the reason why it's played out in this way is because of these longstanding assumptions that are built into the fabric of society about who does care work, where that care work happens, and how it will be supported. Okay, so let's take it back to the city, and we can look in a very literally kind of a concrete, a bricks and mortar sense at some of the ways that kind of patriarchal norms are, again, built into the city. And earlier when I said that women know on a gut level that the city is man-made, it's often because our very everyday, mundane, banal encounters with urban space remind us of this. Just as we try to go about our daily lives, we recognize that this is a world that has not been designed with our needs and experiences in mind. So even if we just take each of these images kind of quickly in turn, we can get a sense of this. So we see what passes for public toilet provision in many places, which again, during the pandemic, as we've been encouraged to be outside more and using public space, the lack of safe, clean, gender neutral or gender welcoming toilets with spaces for care for children or disabled people that are safe and comfortable for women to use, really for anyone to use, honestly. But, women do have some different toilet related needs than most men, depending on, your particular biology. So uh, toilet provision, it's not a glamorous issue to think about, but it's one that really can impact how we can participate in daily life in the city. The trying to go down the steps of a subway with a stroller or even just with small children, or your groceries, your packages, your laundry is an incredibly difficult task, and in fact a dangerous task, as many people experience falls and are risking the safety of themselves and their children to navigate these systems. And again, that kind of assumption of the 9 to 5 rush hour, women who are, or really anyone who's on the subway with children at that time or strollers, we're looked at as like hostile invaders who should not be taking up valuable space at those times of day. The picture of this pedestrian underpass is a good example of the way in which most cities, especially in North America, have really prioritized car traffic over pedestrian traffic. And so we don't want to interrupt a potential roadway with a pesky crosswalk or traffic lights. So we build these tunnels underneath. But for many women, these are among the most terrifying spaces to walk through day or night because they're poorly lit. You don't have great sight lines out of the tunnel at either end. They smell. You don't know what you're going to encounter in them. And finally, we have this image of the classic kind of New York brownstone with all the steps leading up to it. It seems like such a beautiful space, but again, these very, seemingly insignificant architectural details of steps are really frustrating. And I just the other day came across a tweet from Christine Murray, who is a planner who works in the UK on issues of placemaking, but she's also concerned with sort of feminist vision of the city. And she's responding to this tweet about kind of beautiful doorways and entranceways where they have steps. And she's like, yes, turn your buggy around backwards, roll buggy up steps using back wheel, hold buggy with one hand while fumbling with 3 locks to prevent buggy falling downstairs, push door with butt while holding Yale lock key in turned position, up last step into house, hope other kids follow buggy. So something that seems like it wouldn't be that difficult to deal with, a few steps, well, when you have a stroller and small children, becomes a major production and something that could really limit how much you want to go out and be in the city. Mobility is a key issue, and I think it is related to housing, because a housing project, a building can't just be considered on its own. It isn't just sort of an island floating there. It has to be connected to the rest of the city. It has to be connected to work and school and shopping and green space and social services and medical services, all those sorts of things. So we have to think about how is housing connected and how are people able to move through the city. And again, this is a gendered issue. In most cities around the world, women have less access to a private car, so they're more reliant on public transit. In many cities where women live in public housing or more affordable housing outside of the core of the city, they're more reliant on bus transportation than subway transportation, and bus transportation tends to be a little bit slower, a little bit less reliable. It involves waiting outside in the cold, sometimes in areas where you feel unsafe. Women as primary caregivers are also more likely to be traveling with children and strollers, which, as I've already mentioned, is a big issue on public transportation. Women also take more pedestrian trips as part of their trip chaining through the city. So safe areas to walk, areas that are cleared of barriers like snow and ice is also part of gendered mobility, and certainly accessibility around disability, senior citizens is a key issue as well that we have to consider. Okay. So to come to the home then, just to point out so many of the assumptions that are built into our thinking about the home. And again, for many people, the pandemic has been a time when they've had to confront these assumptions, perhaps for the first time. One of them is that the home is a safe space. The home is actually the site of the most violence that women face. So those scary tunnels are not great spaces for women, but technically, statistically, women are much more likely to face violence within the home from people that they know. So when we think about what the home is, domestic violence is a home-related issue, but it's also a city and planning and policy-related issue and an affordability issue because it's often financial dependence that keeps women trapped in unsafe housing with abusive family members. Jessica already mentioned the idea of the home as being for the family and the nuclear family, where the notion of family is very narrowly defined around romantic relationships and parental relationships, when in fact, in the modern world of today, families typically don't look like that in the majority, or they are more complicated than that. There's blended families, there's intergenerational families, there's friends, there's polyamorous families, queer families, all sorts of different constellations of what the family can be. We also assume that the majority of care work in society will be done for free in the home, usually by women. And again, this has been really come to a boiling point, a crisis point during the pandemic. And we need to really rethink how we want to organize care work as a society, whether we want to keep it shoved away in the home or whether we want to think about other ways of doing that. Also, the assumption that home is a purely private space can be problematic in terms of us thinking that maybe there's not a lot of policy interventions that we can make around the idea of the home because this is the private space, but that can tend to hide a lot of issues of violence and exploitation. And the idea that the home and the family are the sort of natural building blocks of society has really maybe limited us from thinking about different ways that we could, again, organize the household, organize kinship relationships, and organize care work. So to wrap up then, when we're thinking about making change, when we're thinking about what a feminist housing plan looks like, I completely agree that housing is a major building block of the idea of the feminist city. It's absolutely key, but we do need to shift our thinking a little bit. And this is a moment where we can think about housing, not just housing for women as a feminist project, but can we imagine housing policy that's designed to end or ameliorate gender inequality? So again, moving away just from thinking, what are good houses for women, to actually thinking about housing as a vehicle for greater gender equity. So thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Leslie. This was great. So for the audience, we are not taking live questions today. So if you have a question or you have your hand raised, then please just pop your question into the chat or into the Q&A, and we'll take it that way. A couple of the questions that have come in already, Leslie, I want to ask you about: how can building design help support more feminist housing? And then the sub question to that is, are many of these design issues for seniors as well?
Well, one of the ways around building design would be thinking about, are there kind of a variety of housing styles that we can imagine that go beyond a kind of singular unit that's designed for a kind of, contained nuclear family, even if that's a single parent family, to imagining designs where the potential collectivization of some of the care work could happen, whether those are in communal kitchen spaces, having childcare spaces built right in, spaces where it's easy to watch and look after children. So thinking about housing as facilitating the pulling of care work out of the hands of an individual woman, usually a woman or caregiver in the home, and building designs that could support shared caregiving, which would also be more, efficient in terms of time and labor, but also energy and sustainability as well. And the question about seniors, I think, is very much tied in. Again, we've seen in the pandemic that housing our seniors in long-term care homes has put them at terrible risk. Even here in Canada, most of the deaths in this country have been seniors in long-term care homes. And it's a real sort of failure of imagination to think about ways in which we could incorporate other modes of seniors staying in their homes, living in intergenerational housing, either with their families or with an intergenerational community. And going forward, I think this is a key issue. And of course, women do tend to live longer on average than men and be poorer in retirement than men. So it's also a gender issue.
Absolutely. Thank you. There was another question in the chat that I want to address that's about the issue of sex workers getting access to NYCHA housing because of their criminal records. This, of course, is a really serious issue. And then I would take it a step further. We have the issue for women who are sex workers being denied public housing or subsidies because of their criminal history, which we're getting a bit better on in New York City, but not all the way there yet. And then we have all these female-headed households in NYCHA, which are female-headed because of the criminalization of Black men. So either we have this tremendous generation of Black men who is in prison, or when they come back, they're not eligible to live in public housing. And so therefore the woman is the leaseholder. So now we've, deprived her of a caregiver for her kids, deprived her of her partner for a period of time. And now we make her legally responsible for the rent, even sometimes when the partner returns. So I think finding out re-entry issues that sound like, even ones that sound like they're about men, end up putting a lot of burden on women at the same time. Question about disability. How do you talk about the able versus disabled design gap and the intersections between gender and disability, and then more broadly, the issues of adding on the intersectionality around ethnicity and race and age as well?
Yes, thank you for that question. To me, there's so many different directions to go with this. Disability activism and activism around the built environment and how key the built environment is for equality can really show us that things like design interventions have huge social impacts, because prior to disability rights activism in the 60s and 70s, the idea that disabled people didn't need access to public spaces, weren't entitled to access to public spaces, meant that we could continue to warehouse them in institutions, to not count them as, fully human, as fully members of the community. But many of those spatial changes that allow people to literally just bring themselves into public are part of the social change and the lessening of stigma around disability and so on. So to me, there's a real important lesson to be learned there. I also think that when we think about accessibility, it's not sort of a niche issue of accessibility for women and caregivers, for disabled people, for seniors. We can see this as a constellation of things that will literally make everybody's lives better. So when you have good curb cuts and ramps and working elevators and a physically accessible public transportation system, so many people benefit from that. Even if you're just someone who's like, carrying your load of groceries home, right? You benefit from that accessibility in the built environment. So seeing the ways in which these design interventions are not being targeted at, a small special interest group, but are really about making a more livable city for everyone, I think can help us to maybe sell those ideas when we need to convince people of their importance.
Yeah, so I'll add to that. Our initial project that we started 10 years ago now at CHPC, long before I got here, was the Making Room project. So that project was about how our housing design reflects a nuclear family. It wasn't intended from a feminist lens per se. It was just thinking through that our nuclear family isn't typically the way that most people live. Even people who are in nuclear families spend most of their life not living in a nuclear family, all in the same household together. And yet some of these other configurations that we need, whether it be a polyamorous couple or family, or whether it be something like a family who wants their grandmother to come to take care of their kid, say during a pandemic when they need the extra childcare, or a household that wants to downsize and have a caregiver come when they get older. There's a variety of different ways that are both non-traditional and quite traditional that we live now, and our housing stock doesn't address that. So we did a museum exhibit, also called Making Room, at the National Building Museum a couple of years ago, where we designed what we called the open house, which was a 1,000-square-foot apartment that we built in the actual museum itself. And it was designed to change over to a different housing type for a different household configuration every 3 months. So the same kind of movable walls that you would see typically in a hotel, in a conference center, that kind of makes the space as flexible as possible. We applied that to a housing model where you could start with a house that was designed for 4 roommates. Then you could end up with a mom with a single parent with a child, where it was an open space, but then the sort of nook that the kid could go to bed at night. A studio apartment off to the side for grandma, and then an older couple who could then move into that studio and rent out the other space as they downsized and needed more income. So we didn't talk about it as a feminist issue at the time that we were working on Making Room, but there's all sorts of ways for both traditional and non-traditional families that our housing stock is designed with this precise family in mind. And it gets in the way of our living our life in a way that we don't even think about, because it's, literally the concrete around us. So there's some questions in the chat about zoning. Zoning and building codes certainly create some of this problem. So if you tried to go to the Department of Buildings, they want to know, is this a 1-bedroom or a 2-bedroom? You can't say, well, it's a 2-bedroom, but then we're going to plop in a kitchen later in case, and then shift it over here. You can't design a flexible unit. It's just not how our codes are designed. It's not designed to do a shared family, right? I can't, there's no such thing as a house that's like 2 separate families, but then some space in between so that the kids can play together and one person can watch all the kids. So some of this is, we look at it as being about feminism explicitly, but it's also just about how we're trying to live our life on any given day-to-day basis, even for a traditional nuclear family.
Yeah, and a lot of those zoning decisions are quite exclusionary, even beyond gender. So when we think about suburban areas that are zoned for like single family housing only, right, that is meant to be sort of class exclusive. It ends up also being racially exclusive in terms of an assumption about, again, of one type of family living in this household instead of, say, a multi-generational household, which might be more common among immigrant communities, for example, and certainly low income households can't then move in and have 2 families sharing a large suburban home. So zoning is definitely a tool of inequality, but it can be turned to be a tool of equity as well.
Yeah. We have a question about the disparate impact of evictions and displacement has on women in the pandemic, particularly women of color. So I'll start by saying, in the pandemic, I joke a lot about people saying the pandemic has laid bare, but there's a reason why that's a cliche now, because it really has. Ironically, women were more likely to be essential workers, so they were more likely to be at risk at their day-to-day to have to go to work. I would have assumed that that meant they were more likely to keep their jobs because they were working in industries that were continuing to work and continuing to be needed during COVID. But ironically, women were also more likely to lose their jobs during the pandemic. Thirdly, they're more likely to voluntarily, or, I can't call it voluntarily, to leave the workforce because of their childcare needs that are taking place during this. So it's really this terrible triple whammy for women, and it's erasing, a generation's worth of gains in the female workforce and in the wage gap. And these are things that is not just affecting women personally, that affects the GDP of the United States as a whole. It's not something that we just need to worry about for women specifically. So I think it's too soon to even know what the disparate impact of evictions and displacement are. But I will say, because so many of our very low income households are women, in particular single parents, and in particular single women of color with children, the eviction and displacement has like a real generational impact on those families. Then there's a question about can you point to cities in the US with more feminist housing policies? And I'm going to send this one over to Leslie, because I keep coming back to Canadians. This is the second Canadian that we've had in this series. We have not found great feminist housing policies in the US, but Leslie, tell me if you know others.
It's such a good question. I get asked this all the time, and I really wish I could point us towards that, utopian city that we could all run and move to. Um, it's not so much that there's a particular place, but I think that there are, sets of policies that you're more likely to find in some places than others, which would include everything from rent control to anti-eviction policies, or, limitations on evictions, to places that don't, places with adequate kind of social assistance for people and housing assistance for people. Places where, renting is not seen as sort of a devalued or stigmatized way to live. So, I think we could probably look to more European countries as being a little bit ahead of us on some of these issues. But at the end of the day, when we have a completely or so heavily marketized housing system where housing isn't seen as a basic human right, but really just as a commodity that, you should buy on the open market in some way, then we're going to continue to have these problems.
Sure. Leslie, has your research explored alternatives to policing through the lens of feminism, anti-racism, and urbanism?
I wouldn't say that my research in particular has, but I would make the clear claim that, to me, a feminist city is a police-free city, or a significantly defunded police city, in part because when we think about what defunding the police means in terms of refunding other sorts of things like affordable housing, for example, childcare, mental health services, public health, economic stability. These are the things that create safety from the bottom up, right? When people have what they need to live securely, when they are not pushed towards criminality, when they are stable, when they have employment and education, then I think we create safety at a much more foundational level in society, and then that trickles up, right, through society, rather than trying to, control it top down through policing and surveillance and criminalization. We can't solve social problems through the criminal justice system, but that seems to be the only solution that we've wanted to put forward over the last, 50 years, maybe more, and it really hasn't gotten us anywhere good.
All right, here's a great question. What criteria or definition are you using to classify land use approaches as feminist or anti-feminist? So I'll let Leslie answer first, and then I'll take this one.
I guess, first of all, I would say I don't. I mean, that's not kind of part of what the way that I approach these questions. I'm more interested in thinking about sort of values and principles that kind of guide our decisions. So I don't know that we could, automatically say this is feminist or this is anti-feminist when it comes to those sorts of decisions. It's probably instructive to look at the outcomes of decisions like that, rather than to apply sort of a rubric at the beginning. But all of that being said, there is now a fairly long history of gender mainstreaming in many cities, which is an effort to pass all of your planning, policy, and budget decisions through a kind of gender equity lens, to ask at the outset, is this placement of a new bus stop, or this zoning for a new school, is this going to increase gender equity, or is it going to I don't know, be neutral, or is it going to perhaps be detrimental for gender equity? So you can start to ask those questions early on in the planning process, rather than maybe at the outset trying to divide things into feminist or anti-feminist.
Yeah, I think in our report, we are looking at places where there is a disparity between female-headed households and traditional families, or single women and single men, and seeing what that, we just kind of looked around the data to see where there were these disparities and discrepancies. So one is around the overwhelming number of women living in public housing, which made me think a little bit more, especially when taken with intersection of issues of race and ethnicity, about why our public housing has always played kind of second fiddle to other parts of our housing industry and has never really been in our housing plan. People talk a lot in homelessness, people talk a lot about single men who are homeless. And certainly that can be the most, especially in New York City, the most visible type of homelessness that we see. It's the type of homelessness that you may, see on your walk to the office, on the subway, that kind of is, you interact with the most on a day-to-day basis. But actually the largest number of people in the shelter system are families with children, and primarily single parent, single women headed households. So those are places where we've kind of made those homeless families invisible. And so when we talk about homelessness, we talk about, getting people off the street in a way, frankly, that helps the rest of us to feel more comfortable. But then we allow these homeless families to kind of stay invisible. So we were looking at places where there's a disparity, or where a male default is used to kind of stand in for the generic human being. So I'll shout out again to this Caroline Perez book, Invisible Women, that was about all the different places in terms of medical research, in terms of crash test dummies for cars, all the different ways in which we create a male default and then are surprised when our medicine, when our pulls to hold on in the subway, when our car crashes, affect women in a different way. So we just wanted to take a look and see where these things weren't being addressed. The wind tunnel question I put in the chat is one that scares me. I don't know what our environmental review standards say about the kind of average person. We say things per person, but then we never look back to what that definition is of how tall or big or able that person is. So I think we're just looking for places where there's a disparity and where things may inadvertently have a disparate impact on women, even because we're talking about it in a gender neutral way. So I think, we use the term feminist housing plan. I use that intentionally. I could have said a housing plan for everybody, or a housing plan for women and children, or something that sounded a little softer. We actively used a feminist housing plan, but primarily in practice, what it means for us as a researcher is places where the male default gets in our way, or whether because we're not disaggregating by gender, we don't see the different impact that this may have on women or men. For example, in terms of the location of housing, as a houser, we would never think a building that is 2 blocks from the subway versus one that's 8 blocks from the subway. We think we need affordable housing everywhere. It really doesn't matter. There's no point in the process where we say, we'd prefer the 2 blocks one, thank you. We never look at where the next closest school is, right? We just say, just build as much as we can, but we are making a lot of decisions about which projects to do and which ones not to do. So let's just try a gender equity lens and see how we may make some different decisions or not based on that. So that's what the feminist housing plan is supposed to be. Here's another good skeptic question for you, Leslie. So this says, while many of your stances have resonance, they seem to speak more specifically to a certain political perspective rather than a gender one. I would argue there are different views on how to approach land use issues from a feminist perspective. For instance, broken windows policing approaches could be used to crack down on street harassment and public safety issues. What do you think?
Well, I think that certainly things like policies like broken windows have been, and the policing tactics that come out of a particular interpretation of broken windows, so we can be quite specific about that, women's safety has been used to justify those things, women's need for safety or women's feelings of fear. But when it comes to something like street harassment, if we're going to criminalize that or put the handling of that into the hands of the police, we have to ask who is likely to be most impacted by that. And given that, I'm just going to say it, I don't think it's a politically motivated statement to say that there is a ton of racial profiling and policing, that most of the people who are stopped and frisked by the police are people of color or trans people or supposed sex workers. And I think if we just say, okay, well, police, you handle harassment, it's only going to end up reproducing those inequalities. And I do not think it will do anything to actually make women safer, especially when we recognize that most of women's unsafety comes from housing situations. So if we put that money and effort into affordable housing, into supporting women in their own housing, into getting them out of the shelter system, that's going to do so much more for actual women's safety than anything that policing interventions could do.
Yeah. So I grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the People's Republic. And there, at least when I was growing up, there was a lot of street signs that you would see saying Cambridge is a domestic violence free zone. And at the time, it was like, I really rolled my eyes at that. I was like, what does that even mean? You're going to put a street sign so he's not going to beat her anymore? Like, what is this even? But what it turns out, what that does mean is that the landlord-tenant laws of the city of Cambridge say that if a batterer is accused or convicted, then the eviction goes to him and she gets to stay in the apartment. So most often the reason why women don't leave, or one of the many reasons why women don't leave, is because they have no stable housing situation to go to. They have nowhere to go. So if you say you're the one who gets to stay, then that would create a whole new set of tools for women who are trying to extricate themselves from those kind of relationships. And to Leslie's point, you're much more likely to be unsafe and be the victim of violence in your own home, which is sort of we think about street crime as being something that happens out in the world. That's actually a thing that happens to men more often. What happens to women is being hurt in their own home. So that's another place where there's that gender disparity. Are you only looking at European design models? If yes, why? We look at European design models because that's where a lot of the good models are, but we totally love to send our way any design models. There's a great book out called Kitchenless City, which again is one of those things that sounds crazy until you actually think about it. That was about kind of shared cooking, shared caregiving models, and saying, this whole concept of having your own kitchen in your own apartment was designed expressly so that women didn't go to work. It was designed expressly to kind of keep you busy and keep you being a consumer. And then there's lots of other more efficient and more helpful and useful ways to feed your family, which are models that exist all around the world.
And some of these models and designs, women in particular have been coming up with them for well over 100 years. This is not a newfangled 21st century idea. That in fact, even in the 19th century, women were talking about the form of the home as something that held them back from intellectual achievement, from education, from political life and cultural life. So we don't even necessarily have to look to Europe. We can look in our own backyard and look at great historical examples of this work having been done for a long time.
Have time for a couple more questions. How does the Feminist-Centered Housing Plan address intersectionality, specifically women who are also Black and trans and disabled, or a combination of these things? All women aren't having the same experience. Yes, this is incredibly important, and feminism, especially in the US, does not have a great history of understanding intersectionality and incorporating that into the activism of the movement. So I think that's a really important issue for kind of the women's movement and feminism in particular to address and face up to and really do some soul searching about. And I think the data that you see for New York City in particular, it bears that out so strongly. There was a piece recently about how many jobs were lost in the US about women. So the headline was, we lost all these jobs, we lost 500,000 jobs in the US, it was all women. Well, it wasn't. White women were actually doing just fine. It was all Black women and women of color that had lost the entirety of the jobs, but that wasn't the headline. The headline was women lost jobs. White women did just fine in the last quarter, and it was Black women and women of color. So I think the more you look at the data, the more and more it's barely even an intersection. It's like a circle. It becomes the intersections are so deep. So making sure that that's a really important message and something that the Feminist Housing Plan has to address. All right. Is there anything else you want to wrap up with, Leslie, in the last couple minutes?
Well, maybe just to jump off of your last comment there, for me, and thinking about the idea of a feminist city more generally, it's not about just replacing that figure of the typical able-bodied white cisgender man with just a female version of like that would be exactly the same. That is not going nearly far enough. So for me, I like to think about bringing the margin to the center, or that idea that, who we have thought of as the minority or the niche housing consumer or city dweller, that if we start from their perspective, if you start from the perspective of a disabled woman, a single mother, a recent immigrant, a trans person, if you start from the perspective of those who have historically been the most marginalized and excluded, and bring that to the center of your planning and policy making, then again, I think there's a trickle up effect from that, where the solutions that we come up with are going to be helpful for a great majority of people, and nobody who's already at the top will be in any way disadvantaged by that. So that to me is kind of how we start to address those intersectional questions, is to bring the margin into the center.
Yeah, and I think there's a moment here, again, the pandemic has laid bare, where it's the safety net is so frayed that we're going to have no choice but to do things differently. And I think that could be a moment where we have to understand this. So particularly in terms of feminism, facing up to intersectionality and being able to do it well in a way that has not been the case in the past. I think there's a generation of white professional feminists who in the pandemic are really having to face up to the extent to which the labor, our own unpaid labor and the unpaid and paid labor of Black women and women of color are, our feminism really relied on that, and it really starts to crumble when with the pandemic and with some of the changes that we had to see. So I think that's a pretty important point. And I think with any luck, we'll be able to really seize this moment, because things are so terrible, in order to find a way to rebuild in a smarter and wiser and fairer way. So again, please email newlens@chpc.org, chpcny.org, if you'd like a copy of Leslie's book, Feminist City, which I highly recommend. It's fantastic. Keep it coming at that same email address if you have other ideas or resources around feminist policies or anti-feminist policies that you see out in the world or in your daily work or in your research. And thank you all so much for joining us here today. We really, really appreciate it. And thanks again to our sponsors who make it possible for us to have these interesting, difficult conversations with you. Really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.